The Fix-It Minister, Megan Woods, is taking charge of managed isolation and quarantine after a series of bungles and says no one will leave any of the facilities without first returning a negative COVID test. The move follows the revelation two women were able to leave managed isolation at an Auckland hotel on compassionate grounds without having a COVID-19 test, despite it being a requirement. The pair also mingled briefly with friends when they weren't supposed to. I spoke to Megan Woods a little earlier and asked her why people are still able to leave managed isolation without having a COVID-19 test.
One of the most important things is actually that these were people who had completed 14 days of isolation. They would have had a check. I think they've got to be really precise with language here. They might not have had the test where a swab was taken up their nasal passage, but what they would have had a health check before they left, which would have included going through symptoms. The procedures I saw when I was on the ground would involve a health check that would not only be the checklist, but there also would have been temperatures taken and a range of other measures. So there were those health checks taking place. That is not how we want it to happen now. In the future, we will be insisting as part of our exit procedures that people need to have a test result that says, I do not have coronavirus as part of their leaving procedure. But what I also don't want, Lisa, is for New Zealanders to get unduly scared, because there were people that have not had the test. They completed their 14 days of isolation, and that is our strongest defence against community transmission.
It doesn't change the fact they were supposed to have a test and they didn't. So people who refuse tests, will you be taking a hard line and keeping them in isolation for the further 28 days that you are legally able to if they refuse the test?
So that's 28 days in total, so it's a further 14 days. And yes, I think you probably heard Dr. Bloomfield talking about how he is seeing the order as it currently stands, that he needs to believe that someone is low risk in order for them to be released. In order to prove that, he said that people need to have a test to do that, and if someone refuses to be tested, then there is the power to extend someone's isolation up to a total of 28 days, doubling it. So,
yes, you have that power, but are you going to use it, Minister? Can you be clear about it? Are you going to use that extra time in isolation for everybody who refuses to have a test before they leave?
People will not be released this weekend unless they have a test. So one of the things I've spent the last day and a bit doing is checking that we have the capacity to have testing at our hotels over the weekend. So I can tell you there's 247 people scheduled to leave today. There's 450 tomorrow and 230 on Sunday. We did 700 tests across hotels yesterday. So we certainly have the capacity to do it. There's not an issue there. And we also, Darren Webb, Air Commander Darren Webb and I had a meeting this morning with everyone who are the operational leads at the facilities and told them what our expectations are.
So you have warned today there are consequences, potentially a $4,000 fine or 6 months in jail if you don't follow the rules around isolation or quarantine. Is there anyone that you're going to look to prosecute?
Well, that, of course, the penalties that are defined by the legislation,
yes.
By the COVID-19 legislation. Look, if people break the law, there will be consequences. We saw that for the rest of the team of 5 million that actually did a much longer period of managed isolation.
You have people who have broken the rules, though. You have absconders who had exemptions to leave and then took off. So are they being followed up with any of these consequences?
Look, that is obviously outside in terms of what the police might be doing. That is outside of what my responsibilities are. But look, my expectations are if people break the law, there are consequences, and we have the powers. And we saw that those powers were exercised while we were in level 4. What we're asking of the people in the isolation facilities, it is a difficult thing to do, to stay in isolation for 2 weeks, but they're wanting to rejoin a team of 5 million that went into lockdown for 5 weeks. We all made a sacrifice to get ourselves into the very privileged position we are as a nation, and we have expectations about the behaviour of the people who are rejoining us.
What about the hotels that have not carried out their duties correctly? For example, the hotel that hosted a private function while having people in isolation, and that private function was in shared facilities that had been used by people in isolation. Are there any consequences for those hotels? Do they get dropped off the list?
Well, those private functions certainly won't be happening again.
But are there any consequences? Are you going to continue to use those hotels?
I'll just answer the first question. So Darren Webb has spoken to the hotels and done a quick audit of this weekend. There are no private functions that will be carried out. He has set his clear expectation that there will not be private functions held out. What we have to do, in answer to the other part of your question about whether or not there will be consequences, we have to see what the agreement that was entered into with health was, whether they were allowed to do it under the contracts were in place. What I can tell you now, Lisa, is our expectation is there will not be private functions carried out at facilities where we have people in managed isolation or quarantine.
Should you have hotels having COVID isolation and quarantine people as well as just ordinary guests?
My understanding is that all of our facilities are exclusive use. There's not other guests. There are a couple of hotels that have facilities that have quite separate and separated accommodation.
Separated accommodation is different to not allowing it at all in the same facility. So what you're saying is that there are guests.
There are some hotels around that have long-stay apartments which are essentially in a different building than the hotel, and that they don't come into contact with each other. This is all the kind of stuff that we're going through line by line and looking at each of our facilities and making sure they are safe.
Okay, so Air Commodore Digby Webb, who does he report to directly? Is that Mike Bush?
Yes, so he's part of the All Government Group.
Okay,
and Mike Bush reports to Brooke Barrington, the Chief Executive of DPMC.
Okay, so he was reporting to Mike Bush when he was brought on in April. So his situation and chain of command has not changed.
Look, Darren Webb's role is quite different. The role that he has today is quite different than the role he had last Friday. One of the things that the Prime Minister has asked to happen this week is that actually we clear up some of the lines of accountability and responsibility.
Okay.
There were a number of people. There wasn't a clear operational link.
Was nobody accountable before, Minister? Is that the problem?
No, there were multiple people accountable.
Too many people.
There is an individual that is accountable. As we move into this next phase and work through, that's what we need to do. That is Darren Webb. He's the one who's having to shoulder this, and this is a huge responsibility. But he did not have those accountabilities or responsibilities this time last week.
And that was the Minister, Megan Woods.